Welcome to the Grizzled Geologist Podcast. I'm Keith Carden, and I'm here with a new friend today, Kent Williamson. He's an author of the book American Heat Engine. It's self-published and it's out now. We're going to talk about his book, which is a historical look at coal, oil, and natural gas. And I'm going to kind of let him run. I was at a happy hour with Brian McDowell of Sabata Energy Consultants. I've been doing some work for him on the side. And actually, I left that happy hour with 3 new podcast guests, including Kent. And we ended up sitting next to each other. He said he was an author. I said I had a podcast. And well, here we are. So again, I'm looking for people to come on the show. Again, this is the Grizzled Geologist. Hit the subscribe on YouTube, notification bell, and the like button. But I'm here with Kent, and we're going to get started. So why don't you give a little background on yourself?
Sure. And thanks so much for having me on, Keith. This is really an honor, and I enjoy talking to folks like you in the industry, and so many interesting stories, and being a history enthusiast, especially American hydrocarbon history enthusiast. I really like doing this, so appreciate you doing this for me and talking to you about it. But my background, originally was not really in oil and gas. I did grow up in Denver, Colorado area, which is an oil and gas town, but I wasn't really aware of that so much growing up. My dad was not directly involved in it, and I did have some exposure, but I didn't really know a whole lot about it. But then fast forward into my career, and I ended up having an opportunity to work for a company called IHS in 2007.
Yeah. Okay.
And so I was hired as a product manager for Petra software.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Okay.
I'm
a Petra user.
Yes. Yeah, and that's why it's really cool to talk to you as a geologist, being on the Grizzled Geologist podcast, because I had been a product manager and so forth before, but I found out about IHS actually by reading Dan Jurgens' The Prize.
Oh, yes.
And I had just seen it at a bookstore. This is about 20 years ago now. And then I looked him up, and it said he worked for IHS, which I had never heard of. And his company, Cambridge Energy Research Associates, or CERA, had been acquired by IHS like a year or so before. And then I find IHS is based in Denver area, where I grew up. And I was like, hey, that's a really interesting company. And so I started applying for jobs, and then they had acquired Petra in 2006. The company was called GeoPlus, and they were looking for a product manager. And they wanted like someone with geology or oil and gas experience. And I didn't have either. I did have product management and, some other factors. And I happened to be in Tulsa. I literally lived a few blocks from their office in the SEG building.
Okay. All right. Tulsa. Yeah, I know exactly where that is.
So anyway, One thing led to another, and I got the job in 2007. And little did I know, I was at, basically ground zero, or a front row seat to the shale revolution. The natural gas, the Barnett was going strong by then. Yep. And some of the others were taking off, like the Haynesville,
That's
Marcellus.
About the time I entered the business, so I'm very familiar with this, and I've been using IHS products the whole time. So it's a small world. Now, I do use Geographics, Petra, and Kingdom, but I do have a special soft spot in my heart for the Petra product. It's so good. My daughter's name is Petra. I didn't name her after the software, but
okay. Yeah,
it's really good, and that's kind of a neat little connection there, because I didn't have any idea going into this that you actually were on that product line.
Yes.
One of my best friends, he swears by Petra. He will not touch anything else.
Well, it's still out there. And
affordable, good.
The plans were to move away from it, but it's so well done. What's interesting is the gentleman that wrote the software was a geologist. He went to OU, and he worked for some different companies, but he was working for City Service in Tulsa in the early 80s. What's interesting is I had never heard of City Service. This is one of the most iconic American oil and gas companies. And, a lot of people know Citgo now, but I had never heard of City Service. But he wrote this software, and so he knew how geologists thought and what they needed. And Petra fit it perfectly. And, that's why, it was so interesting to see. And that's one of the things that kind of inspired me too, is when I got into the job, I started learning about the industry. And then Petra, the way it was designed, it could handle a lot of wells. And so I saw projects with with hundreds of thousands of wells.
Okay.
I even saw one project. There was a guy in Houston who had all the wells in the United States in a
In his
project.
Petra project, that's crazy.
And he would zoom out and zoom in, and it was on a really powerful computer, so it worked really well.
Actually went quick.
Yeah, so anyway, I mean,
As long as you don't put the labels on, right?
yeah. So yeah, and I was like, why are there so many wells in the United States? And one of the reasons is the private mineral rights. And then I found out we're basically the only country in the world that has that. So then I started getting interesting in history. I was like, why is that? And then I spent 15 years with IHS. So I moved up to Colorado in 2011, and I learned about the petrochemical industry, downstream, so everything from upstream to downstream and everything in between. And as I went along, I was like, man, this is just really fascinating, and the unconventional revolution and how it was reinvigorating a lot of our industries, including the petrochemical industry, and our relationship with Latin America. So I got to do a research role for a few years where I was analyzing downstream Latin America. So I was going down to Mexico and some other countries, and it was really interesting to see the interrelationships there with heavy sour crude coming to the United States, and our refining system being optimized for that. And then we export a ton of refined products and NGLs to Latin America and elsewhere. Anyway, after about 15 years with the company, I kind of had an opportunity to move on, and I'd been thinking about this, and I love history, especially American history. And I kind of look back at some of my history books, and I just feel like hydrocarbons are not covered very much. I mean, usually
you can find stuff, but right.
I mean, John D. Rockefeller and Standards usually in there, and coal mining and stuff like that. So,
and you had the books like the Frackers that came out, and the Big Rich and that kind of stuff that really hit like some of the big names. And hey, listen, when you had a kosher that did drive all the work to come to these areas, that's a significant part. But sounds like to me that you've picked up some of the stuff in between.
Yes. Yeah, and that's so I ended up wanting to just write a comprehensive history from the beginning all the way to today. And the other unique aspect to it is it's all the hydrocarbons. It's coal, oil, and natural gas. And, obviously oil and gas are very much related, produced by the same companies in a lot of cases. Coal is a bit separate, it's mined and so forth, and then it has evolved a lot over the years. But what fascinates me when I started researching and as I wrote the book is how interrelated they all are. And so that's part of what I tried to get across. And I wanted to write a book that was not intimidating or like a textbook or an academic book. So it's about 300 pages.
Oh, that's palatable. Sure.
Yeah, it's and I've already I've had many people that have read it, including people that aren't familiar with the industry at all, said it was pretty easy to understand. I mean, there's some stuff that's a little bit confusing,
specific. Sure.
Yeah, but then I've also like industry professionals like yourself have read it and have told me, hey, I learned a bunch of new stuff that I didn't know. So that's
I'm interested in reading it. Full disclosure, we just met. I haven't had a chance, but I think that actually is a great primer to get this out here. I'm a potential, I obviously will be getting the book, but a potential reader. And this is a great way for you to get that out there into my, my little network. And they're avid readers and very smart people. So I think this is a cool pathway and a cool way to meet. So, all right, well, let's get a little bit into this book. Tell us a little bit more about it.
There it is right there. So
okay,
folks want to see it.
Yep. And we'll touch on it again at the end, but can we find it on Amazon?
Yes.
And okay, great. Well, excellent. Well, why don't you give us a little bit of, why don't you get into it a little bit?
All right. So like I said, it's a, comprehensive history, but it's also very high levels. Can't do, that's one of the things with this subject is that was really the most challenging thing about writing the book is like what not to include in it. Cause there's so much that you can put in there and you could dive into so much details. Dan Jurgen's book, The Prize, that was a history of the global oil industry. It was published about 30 years ago now, but that was like over 800 pages long. And it's a great book. And it's still one of my favorite books, but it's, I'm finding when I started researching the writing of the book, the consensus is books are getting shorter and shorter because, people's attention spans are not as great. And there's so many other competing, the phones and videos and social media and cable TV and all that. Most people are just not going to read a 500 to 1,000 page book. So I tried to
Agreed.
keep it, interesting. And then I'm kind of a informal type guy. I'm not really an academic so I try, it's got kind of a lighthearted tone, some, even a little bit of humor and informal stuff in there.
Which I
So
can appreciate. Yeah.
yeah, I tried to keep it entertaining, and it really is entertaining. You go into some of the people, especially that I've uncovered and or remembered, that were back in American hydrocarbon history, are fascinating people, and you
People
just
really
realize,
are the story of
yeah,
most of the time. The people's story is what's fascinating and how they got to why they did what they did,
yeah. So, and it's really interesting to think about too, because you think about like really kind of the 1800s and early to mid 1900s. It was like a whole different from most of human history, and these people, it was like totally new stuff that no one had ever even contemplated before that they were getting into.
Mhm.
Using hydrocarbons for lighting, using it for steam engines, transportation fuel, and all the petrochemical industry and all the transportation and infrastructure that needed to be developed, and for producing steel and
I
other
was just going to
metals.
say steel. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That all
So,
leads to steel. Very interesting. And so does your book start like back with say like oil seeps, or does it start in say Pennsylvania?
so it starts, I actually have a little bit, after the intro, I have a little few paragraphs on the geologic history of North America. And it's very, high level, just basic stuff. It's really kind of aimed at people that don't really know about hydrocarbon deposits and so forth. It's basically, why does North America have so much? And I mentioned the Appalachian Basin
Mhm.
and the way the North American continent was positioned way back when around the equator. And
Exactly.
it was
Yeah.
hot and there was a lot of vegetation at different times and there were inland seas and so forth. And
Shallow inland seas and all these things. Sure.
so I start there, but then I kind of pick up in the early American history. So I have a few paragraphs on Native Americans who also were aware of, they knew about hydrocarbons and used them in different ways. And and they were, of course, aware of seeps, so natural oil and natural gas seeps. And they used oil for what many civilizations have used it for is medicinal uses.
Hmm.
So, Vaseline, which we still have today, is a descendant of, and it actually came out of the early Pennsylvania oil fields, but that concept is really a descendant of using petroleum for medicinal purposes, and it has good uses for that, for wounds and things like that. They used it for waterproofing. So, California tribes, those are some of the most famous natural
I
oil
would
seeps.
assume because they've got the biggest seeps out there. But there are no shortage of them. They're in the Rockies and,
Yeah.
coal and, there's a bunch of stuff at the surface there.
So, and then Europeans, of course, came over and they were very familiar with, especially coal, because Europe has a lot of coal. But
Hmm.
they quickly noticed the natural oil seeps and natural gas seeps. So, I was actually just telling an acquaintance earlier today whose dad was from West Virginia that George Washington he served in the French and Indian War out in western Pennsylvania and West Virginia areas before the Revolution. But he ended up getting some land out there, and he observed and wrote about natural seeps out
Hmm.
there. But part of his land was what's now Burning Springs, West Virginia, and
Okay.
that actually had a burning spring. Sometimes people would ignite those things,
Hmm.
or lightning or forest fires would ignite them, and they'd sit there and burn for years, and they were like landmarks and stuff.
Yeah.
So that was I definitely cover all that all the way through early industrialization, kind of mainly starting in the early 1800s, and then heavy industrialization, latter part of
Turn
the
of the century.
1800s, and then I get into of course, the advent of the oil industry in 1859 and Titusville, natural gas, how it kind of came in fits and starts, and then got really going in towards the late 1800s, early 1900s, and then
And
how
that
they
was out
all.
east. And you, as the kind of author here, I do have a question about that because I think it was the Big Rich that I was reading. So out east, where you're talking about, they did start to use natural gas for like lamps and heating and stuff. But it was really in the Permian Basin, if I'm not mistaken, when they actually started like capturing it in pipelines and central facilities and going out from there. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the
No, they
assumption.
started more in the Appalachian
Okay.
areas.
Okay.
what's interesting
Actually
is,
piping it and collecting
yeah.
and okay.
So natural gas, actually, it's debatable, but I mean, the natural gas industry somewhat technically predates the oil industry in the United States. So in the
Okay.
1820s, early 1820s, there was a natural gas well in New York on the coast of Lake Erie.
Hmm.
And this gentleman basically set up, he used like hollow logs and some different kind of jury rig type stuff and ended up setting up kind of a mini gas utility for a while there. So,
Okay.
but
Okay.
natural gas, of course, people were aware of it, and they did, it was used in kind of patchy applications for like the salt industry.
Okay.
So that's one area that I get into a lot in the book. I call salt the honorary American hydrocarbon because salt drilling is actually so there was a lot of natural salt licks, especially in the Appalachian area and the Ohio River Valley. And that's, of course, where animals would come congregate and Native Americans and then, European American explorers and hunters would hunt these animals. Salt was actually a critical component of surviving on the frontier. You couldn't survive without it because salting meat and animals needed it,
Yeah.
livestock.
Yeah. And hydration. Actually, you have to have it to be able to actually
Yeah.
be hydrated.
So originally, a lot of our salt was imported from Britain and elsewhere, but obviously that was tough to get into the interior of the United States and the Ohio River Valley and stuff. So they eventually started drilling salt brine wells and then evaporating the brine and getting the salt. Native Americans did it. Now, you could use wood, but wood is not very dense, so coal is actually better for the evaporation. And then if they had it in certain areas like what's now West Virginia and so forth, they did try to use natural gas. But it was tough you had to have piping
And
and
say, how did they collect it? You know?
yeah. Well, originally most natural gas, it was just basically they would natural seeps and shallow wells, and then they would try to, get it into pipes. And it totally depended on the pressure of the formation. But then, of course, no one really understood the subsurface at that point. So the natural gas would run out and then they'd have to go back to coal or something else.
Okay.
But really what got
Very
the natural
interesting.
gas industry going in a big way was in the 1870s around Pittsburgh. So and that's where, of course, Western Pennsylvania is where the petroleum industry got going in 1859. And they were drilling all over there and they were producing a lot of natural gas. And they started using it for local oil and gas operations to run steam engines. And they even piped, they piped some of it into smaller towns around, the original oil fields for heating and cooking fuel and so forth. But in Pittsburgh in the late 1870s, there was a well at Murraysville, Pennsylvania, and it was called, now I'm having a mental block on the name of the well, but it was
Of
a
course.
huge,
There's a lot of them. It's okay.
it was a huge blowout, and it basically it caught on fire and it was burning for several months before they got it under control. And the Pugh brothers ended up getting involved, and they ended up buying it, and then they set up a natural gas utility. They had piping, and that grew from there. So Appalachia is really where natural gas got its start as far as what we know of it today, like
It's a utility.
for utilities. But the industry around there, including Carnegie Steel, loved it because it saved money and it was cleaner than coal. And so Andrew Carnegie actually even wrote like a pamphlet on it about how much money it saved him and how much cleaner and so forth. But again, the problem happens is they kept using it. They didn't understand the geology and
The reservoir aspects and
Yeah.
you've got depletion and you're going to have to go somewhere new
Yeah.
eventually.
And it started running out, and then then they would have to switch back to coal or whatever. So the other aspect of natural gas that kind of took place was related to coal, and this is one of the fascinating interrelationships. So coal, you could produce a flammable gas from burning coal. It was called manufactured gas, and that started in the early 1800s and it tended to be in kind of the bigger cities and towns. And you could, these companies would have gas houses, and they would burn coal or other things, and then they would generate a low heating value gas, and they could pipe that. And it was mainly for lighting at that time, so gas lighting.
Yes.
And this was before electricity, but that over from the early 1800s till the late 1800s when electricity was introduced, so forth, that's what a lot of more urban dwellers with a little bit more money would use for lighting instead of candles and lamps. But
Yeah.
those were kind of the first natural gas utilities were actually coal-generated manufactured gas. So some of the same infrastructure that ended up being used for natural gas in cities was originally manufactured gas.
I'll be
And so
darned. And
then,
so what is the mechanism there? So I guess you kind of slow burn this coal.
yes,
It creates heat, but some of the hydrocarbons are longer, so they just kind of evaporate and they're collected, I guess. Kind of like a modern refinery in a way.
yes.
Like that had to have collected based on density, essentially, right?
Well, it's kind
And
of like it's hydrogen and some other elements,
I'll be
the
darned.
gas, but
Okay.
it's not. So the original technology was not, it produced a gas that was flammable, but it wasn't heating, didn't have enough heating value to
BTUs.
really use for cooking or heating. But what was kind of interesting is, yeah,
Fascinating.
it's kind of too long of a story to get into here, but
Sure.
basically once the oil industry took off, then there was a gentleman that I get into in the book. His name was Thaddeus S.C. Lowe, and he developed a method of basically at the early oil industry, they were focused on kerosene for lamps.
Yes.
And that actually, the kerosene lamp actually pushed back, it retarded the further growth of the manufactured gas industry because it was so cheap and it was so good. A lot of
And it
people,
had the BTUs.
yes. So, but then this guy Thaddeus S.C. Lowe developed it was called carbureted water gas process. And basically, the early oil industry did know what gasoline and naphtha, they had different names for it, but it was usually a waste product. Sometimes it was used as a solvent or it was just thrown away. But he figured out how to spray this stuff into a chamber where the coal gas was coming, and that would carburate it, and it would basically make a higher heating value gas that could be used for heating and cooking. It also required a smaller facility to produce. So then it spread manufactured gas around to a lot of smaller and medium-sized towns around the United States in the late 1800s, even when electricity was taking off. So it kind
And
of
so we're
gave
to about the 1880s, 1890s at this point
yes.
in the story, because we did start with we've got a little timeline going here. So we're
Yeah.
about to the turn of the century. So what's going to happen next?
So that's yeah, and so I have a whole section in the book on the turn of the century, and it's kind of, it's historically, of course, it's just an arbitrary date, but it's amazing kind of how many things kind of happened, on before and after 1900. So, what really, I mentioned electricity. Of course, you have Edison and the light bulb in the late 1870s, and then the first electrical network in 1882 in New York, which was the DC network that Edison set up in downtown New York City, and that used a coal plant right there in the city, coal steam engine to generate the electricity. Then you may be familiar with the current wars between Edison, he wanted direct current, and then Westinghouse and Tesla with alternating current. The Westinghouse is an interesting guy. He appears in the book too. He was in Pittsburgh. And he had done a bunch of different stuff, but he was actually a natural gas entrepreneur before he got into electricity. And he actually drilled a natural gas well on the front yard of his mansion in Pittsburgh. And it was a huge well, and it was sitting there. It produced a ton of natural gas. And he set up a gas utility in Pittsburgh too in the 1880s. So, but he later, of course, got into electricity with Tesla, and they did the alternating current and won that particular battle. So all this happens in the late 1800s. And of course, with alternating current, that allows more distant
Yeah.
generating plants, and then you get into the economies of scale and so forth. If you want, do you know who Emmett Penny is?
I've heard the name. Sure.
Yeah, he's on Substack. Look him up. He's done a couple really interesting write-ups on Samuel Insull, who he's in my book too, but Emmett gets into a lot more detail about him. He worked for Edison, and then he went off on his own, and he was like one of the pioneers of the huge gas and electric utilities that formed in the late 1800s and 1930s before they were kind of broken up.
Okay.
But
Cool.
he was more than almost anyone responsible for spreading electricity and natural gas utilities, widely across the United States. So the other thing, of course, is the automobile, which, they developed some early ones in Europe in the 1870s, 80s, and so forth, and then here in the United States. But the turning point was really the Ford Model T in 1908, when Henry Ford introduces that. Before, automobiles had been kind of a toy for people people that had more money. Most people couldn't afford them. The Ford Model T changed that, and that's when that really took off. And then it was like, well, the fuel for it, the gasoline engine had proved its superiority in the years prior.
Mm-hmm.
And I get into a whole. There was an auto show in 1901. It was right around the time of Spindletop, which was the major Gulf Coast strike in 1901.
Yep.
So that extended the American oil industry. There were some others in Indiana, Ohio, late 1800s, but the Spindletop in 1901, and then Glenpool here in Oklahoma in 1905, that really extended the American oil industry, closer to nationwide.
Yes.
And then that proved that we had the oil resources to produce enough kerosene, gasoline, fuel oil, to fuel all of these machines that were coming out, automobiles, steam engines.
Yeah.
So
the factory and just some major manufacturing stuff. Yep.
So all that stuff. But, before there was because the original oil fields in Pennsylvania were kind of waning by the late 1800s, early 1900s. So it was like, where's this stuff going to come from? Well, the answer was apparent. So then, around 1900, all this stuff happens. You've got automobiles coming out. You've got airplanes. The aviation industry is born. Yep. And then shortly thereafter, the ships start switching from coal to fuel oil. And the U.S. Navy switches from sail to coal in the late 1880s, and then coal to fuel oil around World War I. So all of these things happening, and it's all really fascinating to see how it affects, hydrocarbons and American hydrocarbons.
From my perspective as an explorer and the person, I've gone out and looked at a lot of these wells, data-wise, and so there are a lot of pulses. And like you're saying, you have the Glenpool, Spindletop, so the Texas stuff, the Oklahoma stuff, those were discovered turn of the century, but when you really started to see it ramping up was in the 20s. Like, I would say the biggest pulse, just based on my knowledge, was like 1922, probably, when, a lot of these big structures were discovered, some of these new fields, and the technology at the time had, the geology had started to bear fruit. So how did that work with you? So you talked with the automobiles and airplanes and new factories were driving the kind of, I don't want to say switch from gas to petroleum products, but you did kind of naturally show a little bit of a progression there. So in the early turn of the century, this was driven by growth, economic growth, but then you get into the world wars and what happened there.
Yeah. And so, that's, you mentioned you are a geologist, and we are on the Grizzled Geologist podcast here. So that's what's fascinating is geology really wasn't used much, through the first several decades of the oil and gas industry. I mean, there was some, but there was a lot of, it was looking at surface seeps and then
looking for hills and seeps and
closeology. So if one well was successful, then you drill a whole bunch of others really close and just produce as much you can. The rule of capture, so forth. So geology the United States Geological Survey actually, late 1800s, they did a lot of groundbreaking work in a variety of areas. And that eventually seeped in. There was actually also a lot of kind of superstition and, stuff that you had the sticks,
the divining rods. Yeah.
Hey, they would actually use those.
Listen, the company that I last worked for, it's the West Edmond Hunt and Lime Unit. It was discovered in 42 with a divining rod. Okay. Yeah. So that didn't really go away. There's still people that, I swear there's still people that mess around with that kind of stuff. But so the geologists did, and you're right, they had the geo surveys of the late 1800s. But again, like along with the wells being drilled, the 20s was another proliferation of beautiful subsurface geology. I mean, those were still the reports today,
Yeah.
But go ahead.
I covered that in the book. The first one that, at least documented was 1916 was El Dorado field in southeastern Kansas, just near Wichita. And it was actually Cities Service. So Cities Service, which I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, the gentleman that wrote Petra, worked at Cities Service before they got acquired by Occidental. And, City Service goes back, and it's a really fascinating company because I won't get into the whole history of it, but it was this gentleman, Henry Doherty, was the head of City Service. And it started out as basically a natural gas utility in southeastern Kansas, but then it expanded into upstream because he wanted to have, supply his own natural gas.
Yep.
But he was pretty forward thinking, and he used geologists to do actual subsurface mapping of that field in southeastern Kansas. And that was the first where they did not, they just used pure geologic interpretation to drill a well, and they hit oil with it.
And they did. Yep.
Pretty
I
cool
actually
stuff.
dink around up there in southeast Kansas. I've drilled a few wells myself out there. It's a kind of a neat place.
And that's what's fascinating too, is all the technological advances in the industry, which is amazing, from software to geophysics and geomechanics. I think you had a podcast on that and all the other stuff. But what's fascinating is I've talked to people in the industry, including a guy that I know from my gym here, who still draws he hand draws
And contours maps. Yeah.
And he flips logs. So he was upset that the Tulsa Log Library was closing down. He's like, I might have to go down to Edmond, or I might have to learn how to use Petra. So
No, seriously, there's a few people still sliding logs for sure.
Yeah. I remember I met one guy one time. He was an OU grad, and he had gotten into, it was like he specialized in 2 counties in northern Oklahoma and 2 in southern Kansas. And he called it the
Sounds like Osage, K, Cowley, and Sumner to me.
But he called it the state line fault line. He said, you'd be surprised what you can, because people usually look on one side or the other in a state. And if you can find stuff that's straddling 2 straight state lines and deal with the complications, you can actually find a real profitable niche. And he apparently had. So.
That's cool. Yeah, that's
Interesting
cool.
folks. Always, love
that's
talking
awesome. Yeah, no, and it is the stories and these people's history that really highlight all of this. But so let's kind of wrap up. Let's get to the modern day. We went through the world wars. What kind of history do you share in this book regarding that? And then the transition, I'm going to assume, to horizontal.
Yeah. So I mean, the way I broke down, I do talk about World War I, but then I really, World War II, I kind of lump it together with the Cold War. So I kind of have a little bit different, because I basically look at that as one huge struggle against totalitarianism.
Okay.
And the United States is instrumental in defeating fascism in World War II, including propping up the Soviet Union. They were our ally during
They were the
that war.
allies.
But without us, and I have a quote from Stalin. He basically acknowledges that without the United States, he would have lost the war. But then afterwards, of course, we move right into the Cold War, and communism is just another form of totalitarianism, and we grind out the Cold War against the Soviet Union and others, Chinese and others, for 50 years. And you could say we're still doing it to an extent these days, but 1990s Soviet Union collapses.
I remember that specifically.
Get into that whole history about what a monumental task that was for the United States. We supplied 90% of the oil for ourselves and the Allies in World War II, oil and refined products. And if you really look at it, that war, there's no way we could have won that war without oil, natural gas, and coal. And
it was units like that West Edmond Hunt and Lime unit that was discovered in the 40s. That was that field is actually producing jet fuel. We'd come across resources that, with the geology and the stuff that you'd spoken about. By World War II, we'd kind of started to figure it out, and we were in pretty full-scale exploration and production.
Yeah. And then, after World War II, of course, the Western Europe and Japan and Korea, they're all devastated. And then they're become our allies, and we help rebuild them through the Marshall Plan and other mechanisms. And then we can't keep supplying them with as much oil, because we lifted all our rationing restrictions, and then our economy booms after the war. The cars and suburbs and all that, and so that's when the Middle East comes in, and there's a lot of heartache over our involvement in the Middle East, and for good reason in a lot of cases. But people forget the Middle East was pivotal in the post-World War II years, especially in the Cold War. Because Europe was devastated, and they had coal shortages. They had some of the toughest winters on record in the late 40s. And there was threats of mass starvation and things like that. And the Middle East becomes pivotal in supplying Western Europe, Japan, and other Asian allies with oil through the Cold War. And then, I think we kind of forget the Soviet Union, it had way more people than we did, and it covered a huge swath of Eurasia. And then you've got communist China and so forth. And we fought the Korean War in the 50s and so forth. And supplying, helping our allies rebuild, and then holding off global communism for 50 years was a test of endurance. And I try to get into that. So
That's
then
awesome.
You hit the 70s and the oil crises, the energy crises of the 70s. And I get into that. And then I have a little section, which it's one of my favorite parts of the book. It goes back to coal. I call it Coal Rides Back into Town. And of course, there was a lot of factors involved, but there's high and volatile oil and natural gas prices. There were severe natural gas shortages in the 70s. And, we restructure our energy industry in a lot of ways, but we end up needing a lot of coal. And most of that coal ends up coming from the Powder River Basin in mostly Wyoming, some in Montana. It's subbituminous, it's low in sulfur, and it's huge surface mines. And then we restructure our railroad industry, which I cover a lot in the book too. And that makes it economic to ship this coal all over the place. And I grew up in Denver, and where I grew up, there's some tracks. You can see that Powder River Basin coal coming down those tracks. And there's a coal burning power plant in downtown Colorado Springs that's still using that stuff. So fascinating.
I love Denver too. Man, I love it up there.
I love how coal kind of came back, and it gave us a big breather when things weren't so good in the 70s. And then, we had renewed growth in the 80s and 90s. And then, of course, from the energy crises in the 70s, that's where a lot of the research grew for the shale revolution. That's kind of the end of the book. I get into that. And then I take a brief look at the future. I'm not a Nostradamus or anything. I don't know what's going to happen. And I think when you read the book, you'll see that most of the predictions that people had at various stages never really happened. It seems to go. We keep finding new ways. And then, I talk about some potential new sources that have been out there. So on the oil side, the oil shale out in western Colorado. And I remember that as a kid, when they were doing that stuff, and it basically collapsed in the space of a few days or weeks in the 80s. But then, of course, methane hydrates is kind of the big unknown in natural gas. And then coal, I call coal the tragic hero because it's kind of, it's the hydrocarbon everyone loves to hate. Even a lot of people in the natural gas, industry, but it's still vital for some of our electricity production, for making steel, of course. But it's also, I'm seeing it's kind of going back to its old roots. So the manufactured gas industry would produce coal tar, and coal tar was one of the original growth areas for our petrochemical industry. So they started figuring out how to use things, including dyes, things like that, out of coal tar. So now I see a lot more stuff about using coal for coal ash and other stuff to get the specialized minerals, rare earth minerals out of, and then using coal for, there's new processes for kind of burning coal and then getting more processes out of it, like petrochemicals and other fuels directly from it. So who knows what will happen with coal, but I point out, we actually have a lot more coal in the United States. We have the most coal of any country in the world.
I didn't realize that.
We have way more of it than we do as far as, geologic reserves than we do of oil and natural gas.
Interesting. Yeah, coal has been kind of a baseline for civilization. If anything, and let's just be real, it's a solid that you can move around, it's efficient in what it does.
Yes.
And that's an interesting look. So you did the whole thing. You start from the oil seeps to the people, just to the Native Americans using it for healing, to the later 1800s where we're starting to get the Industrial Revolution, actually seeing these things as utilities and tools, all the way to the explosion of technology and world wars and everything like that. And then end up circling back to kind of, the future. And I think sounds like you've got a really good book there.
Well, I like it. And the people that have read it, I've gotten good reviews on it. So, I'd encourage folks to, I think you'll find a lot of new, even if you're a seasoned veteran in oil and gas or coal or whatever, I think you'll find a lot of new things. And then, if you know people that either just don't know much about it, or, even people that are critical of, the fossil fuel industry and this and that, I think it's, useful to at least understand, hey, I'm not trying to say it's better or worse than any other energy source with this book, but I'm trying to explain how important they've been.
Yeah. And how it got there.
Yeah. I mean, in our development as a country, but also as human civilization, and how important they've been to human flourishing, which is another kind of, thing that I think it's important to look at. I don't know, you may have heard of Alex Epstein.
Oh, yeah.
The moral case for fossil fuels and so forth.
Yes, of course.
He's been really good about reframing how you look at things. And I
My
also
buddy Matt Hatami does that also with his book too. There is a moral case for hydrocarbons.
Yeah, that's why I call them hydrocarbons, the book. I don't like the term fossil fuels because, I mean, fossil fuels is accurate, but they're way more than just fuels. I mean, the feedstocks, and they're vital to human civilization. And I think fossil fuels has become kind of a negative term over the years. So
hydrocarbons is the correct term. I agree with you.
So,
well, do you have any quick words of wisdom for us? We're going to probably wrap this up. Everybody's got to do words of wisdom.
Well, I would just like to say thank you for having me on, but also thank you for what you do. I am not a geoscientist or a petroleum engineer or anything like that, but I've gotten to know many people, and I understand, a little bit about what you do. I just want to point out to the audience, and I imagine most of your audience is in the industry, but I just want to say thank you to all of you for what you do, because you make our lives as we know it possible, and I'm grateful. But for those people that are watching you, or your acquaintances that may not know so much, may not appreciate what you do, I would just say, reinforce. Geoscientists like you, Keith, and others are extremely important. And it's also very interesting folks. The way geoscientists think and so forth is really fascinating to me. Picture things under the earth, really, I can't even fathom it sometimes. And then the engineers that figure out how to produce it. Yeah. So that's one thing. Yeah, I would say one thing I like to tell people sometimes if they're complaining about the price of gasoline. So do you realize that, our oil and gas industry can set up a platform out in the Gulf of Mexico in several miles of water and then drill 15 to 20,000 feet into the earth, pipe oil up through a subsea pipeline to a refinery, refine it, and then get it to your gas station for less per gallon than it costs for a cup of Starbucks coffee? I mean, that's incredible if you think about it.
No, it really is. And I've heard the analogy, and I don't want to mess it up, but you're absolutely right about that. The hydrocarbon industry is the backbone of our civilization. And we've got people like you that are here that are respecting and honoring the history and getting that information out for all of us to be able to read and enjoy. I'm looking forward to reading your book.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on, Kent. Again, you're the author of American Heat Engine. And what's the little subtitle there? Hydrocarbons?
And the Power of the United States. So
I love it.
It is a patriotic book. I'm very patriotic, and that's part of why I wanted to write it too, because I didn't realize growing up how important hydrocarbons have been to the history of the United States, and they have. And then I believe the United States, we're far from perfect, but I believe we've been a force for good generally in the world, and hydrocarbons have a lot to do with that. And so I think it needs to be learned. I feel like I wish we would learn more about it in school growing up. It can be a tough subject to understand, but it's my little contribution to try to make it easier to understand and make it a little bit entertaining too.
Hey, listen, like I said, I'm really looking forward to your book. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This is The Grizzled Geologist. I'm Keith Carden. I'm looking for folks to come on my show. Make sure that you subscribe to my YouTube channel. I'm on Spotify. Make sure you hit the like, hit the subscribe. Keep tuning in. I'm going to have at least one episode every week. Thank you again, Kent, for coming on. And to all you other authors out there, keep on writing those books and giving us the information we need. We'll see you.
All right. Thank you, Keith.
Adios.
You have to work for it. Don't be crazy. And work for your money.